All right, so in this tutorial, we're going to go ahead and begin to add materials to our 3D model. Okay. Now, I should make kind of this note before we get started that this tutorial is to add materials with the kind of plan to use the Rhino rendering engine within Rhino to create the rendering, right? Rhino is not a rendering software. Rhino is a software to 3D model. That's what its strength is. However, it does have a rendering engine built into the software, so we can do some renders. And Rhino render is pretty decent. You can get away and you can do quite a bit and make the 3D model look or make the render look rather photorealistic. But it's still not a rendering software, right? If you're looking for those like high quality renderings, then you're going to want to download a rendering software like Enscape, Twinmotion, D5. There's all sorts of them. V-Ray. There's all sorts of them out there that are available. And how you go about adding materials changes and differs depending on the rendering software. Certain rendering softwares will take the materials straight from Rhino and import them seamlessly with into their own program. Other rendering softwares want you to apply the materials a certain way. Other rendering softwares, their materials library is much more, it's much larger than the Rhino's materials library. So there's all sorts of different things to take into consideration if you are using a rendering software outside of Rhino. Okay. But for this tutorial, we are using the rendering software that lives inside of Rhino. So we're applying the materials um, with that in mind. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to add materials and we're going to kind of go deeper into the materials with every new material that we begin to add, right? But I want to start off with just like a very basic, simple, how do you even add materials? Okay. I'm going to pull this window out. I'm going to copy it. Okay. And we're going to be doing a lot of toggling back and forth between our layers tab and our materials tab, which is this little kind of, I don't know, you know what? I don't even know what you call that. The little packet of paint. I'm sure you guys probably have a better idea of what that is, what that's called. But we're calling it the packet of paint. Um, all right, so I'm going to click on the packet of paint. We're going to hit the plus sign here because we need to add materials. By default, materials are not available to you in Rhino. You have to add them. So we're going to click on this plus sign and we're going to select import from materials library. And that's going to take me into Rhino's materials library. Now, I do recommend that you take some time and just kind of click around and see what materials exist in these folders. It has a pretty decent library, actually. Make sure that you can, or just know that you could always change the view. This is how the materials should show up on your screen. Okay, so I'm going to start off by adding a metal to my window frame. So I'm going to go into say satin, and we'll just go ahead and pick satin, aluminum, although platinum and titanium look kind of nice. Now, you should kind of think of materials kind of as a visual, not so literal, right? So, for example, if I wanted kind of a darker shade of metal, then I might pick titanium because that's the visual, that's the graphic that I'm getting. This is not saying, or am I stating that the window frame is going to be made out of titanium, right? The same way that I'm not actually going to build this thing out of, if I use the gold material, it doesn't mean that I'm actually building the thing out of gold. It's just a visual, right? So don't take the descriptions too literal. Just look at the image and see if that's the image that you want. Okay. So I'm going to select satin aluminum, hit open, and now we can see aluminum, or we can see our material right inside here. Okay. I'll go ahead and select the object. Oh, so this is all one. The glass and the frame are grouped, so I'm going to ungroup them. Okay. I'll go ahead and select the window frame. I'm going to right click and assign to objects. Okay. Now it doesn't look like it did much, and that's because I'm in the shaded view. In order to see the materials, we have to be in the rendered view. So I'll go into rendered, and that doesn't really help my case. It still looks pretty gray, right? But that's just because everything else is already kind of in a gray. So this is the satin aluminum. Take my word for it. But let's go ahead and add the glass, and then we'll really get to see the material better. So let's hit the plus sign again, go into the materials library, and this time we have a folder called glass. We have frosted, but I actually prefer to use the light blue glass. The green glass is also kind of nice, but we'll do the blue glass. I'll hit open. I'll select my glass, and I'm just going to right click and assign to object. There we go. So now you could see that this is in fact glass. And that's, I mean, at the very basic, that's how we add materials. You import the material you want, you select the object, and then you right click and you assigned the material to the object. It's pretty simple and straightforward. But there are ways we could streamline this. So for example, this window here, I had to take out, ungroup, add the material to the frame, add the material to the glass, right? Now I have several windows here, and I do not want to have to go through that process for every single window. So instead, what I'll do is I'll come over here to my materials, sorry, to my layers, and because I did such a great job at organizing all of my geometry into layers, um, I can go over here to my Windows layer. I can click on Windows frame. It's just a single click. I'll right click and then I'll hit select objects. And you'll notice that now all of my window frames have been selected. Okay. Even though my glass and the frame themselves are grouped together, because they are in an individual layer, it's selecting only the object that is in that layer, regardless of whether or not it's grouped. Okay. So now that everything is selected, I can come back to my materials tab, right click on satin aluminum, and just hit assign to objects. Let's do that one more time with the glass, window glass, right click, select objects, come over to my materials tab, and then right click on the glass and assign to objects. Okay. And there we have it. Now, just like that, all of my windows were have the glass in the frame. Now you'll see that that didn't happen with my door window or this one over here. And that's because they're in my door layer. So if I select door frame, select objects, come back to my materials, and then right click assign to objects, do the same thing one more time with our glass. Oh, let's go ahead and click out. All right, door glass, select objects, go to my materials, and then add the glass. And there we have it, right? Let's go ahead and delete this. Um, so that's how we could apply materials to entire objects. These are objects that have that material throughout the entire object, right? So in other words, like the frame itself, all sides of the frame are going to be aluminum. So we applied the material to the entire frame. However, you're going to run into problems or you're going to run into instances where maybe one side of the object is going to be one material and the other side of the object is going to be another material, like my walls, right? By the way, when I talked about putting everything in my layers, I missed a couple things. So you see those lines? Um, those were not put in my lines layer. It's not that big of an issue because when we do the actual render, these lines will not show up, but they are a bit annoying just to look at. And did I not? Okay. So let's go ahead. I'm going to put these. There we go. All right. As you can tell, these little lines bother me. Um, all right. So if I want to add a material to only one side or to a surface, then what we can do is use this kind of command, this keyboard shortcut, which is Control Shift and then click. That's for if you're on a PC, Control Shift and then click. If you're on a Mac, it'll be you'll have to test this out. It's Control Shift and click or Control Command and click. So it's one of the other ones. It is Control. It's just a matter of whether or not it's Control Shift um, or Control Command. Um, but if I do Control Shift and click, you'll notice that now the surface is selected, not the entire object, as opposed to if I was to just click on it, the entire object is selected. So let's go ahead and start painting the walls, right? Adding a paint material. So I'm going to come over here. We'll hit the plus sign. We'll import from material library, and I'm going to go over to paint. And I'll select, I don't know, this is the sheen. We'll go with an eggshell and then choose a color, right? Now, these are all just kind of examples, color examples. It doesn't mean that you're limited to only these colors. Okay. I actually like this sea salt eggshell, so I'll select this. We'll hit open, and now we have it, right? Right there. But I could always just click on this color palette right here, this little color box right there, and I can choose whichever color I want. Okay. Sometimes, if like you want to be very, very specific, if you go and you have a paint sample that you get at a paint store, you could always ask, or you could even Google this too. Like if you have a paint name, I don't know, Sherman Williams uh, Aqua Blue, right? If you Google it, you should be able to find the RGB values. So red, green, blue. It'll say RGB. And then you could just input those numbers right inside here and it'll give you the value. It'll give you the color it'll give us that aqua blue that we're looking for, right? You probably don't want to paint a house aqua blue, by the way. So anyways, you have that option to adjust the color however you want, but I'm gonna leave it as the sea salt color, okay? And then we're gonna go ahead and just start clicking on the surfaces. So Control Shift, click, 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 and then I'll right click and assign to objects. There we have it, right? Now, I'm probably going to, not probably, I'm going to want all of this to be the same material. Same right here. Okay. So I will assign to objects. Oh, what happened here? Assign to objects. That get, yep, okay. Because remember, we build the model in the way that it works within Rhino, right? But the reality is that when we actually construct this house, we're going to add a layer of stucco or whatever finished material we have, and it's going to cover our floor joists. So make sure that these materials are the same. The same thing goes for right here. So I'm going to go ahead and add these materials right there. Okay. And if I wanted to, we could go ahead and add that material because we've changed the ceiling, right? And I would add that just like that. Okay. All right. So we have an idea now of how to add um, materials like glass and aluminum and how to use the paint. I want to go ahead and take a minute and add my, okay. So we're going to click import materials and we have a folder that's specific to roof. It's in the architectural folder and there's our roof. Okay. We could do slate roof tiles, shingle roof tiles, ceramic tiles. I'll go ahead and just click ceramic. And I'll go with a, I don't know, ceramic gray. All right, I'll hit open, and there's my ceramic gray material. I'll go ahead and hold down the shift key and just click. It's really hard to tell, right? I mean, it's really hard to tell that there's surfaces here, but we've modeled this thing, we've been looking at this thing for so long, we know without even seeing any line work, we know where the panels are. So I'll go ahead and select this. We'll go right click and assign to objects. And there's my roof, right? Looks great, looks small. The roof tiling itself looks a bit small, but overall it looks pretty good. Until you begin to realize that my material here on this roof slope is vertical, right? And that is not how you would do the roof. The roofing should be horizontal, the way that you see it here, right? But because it's applied as a single kind of texture, it's being shown vertically. And that's going to obviously give us some problems just because that's not how it's supposed to look. The paneling or the shingles on um, on that slope and on this slope should be running horizontally. So we're going to have to rotate that. Okay. So we're going to have to go into the settings and rotate it. Now, before we kind of jump into the settings, I want to take a minute to explain what exactly is the material. And that's because we have to understand that before we go in and change some of the settings. A material in Rhino, and this is pretty true with all rendering softwares, a material in when rendering isn't really a material. We're not actually um, Rhino isn't actually building the geometry to build this roof tile. It is all just a picture. It's a flat two-dimensional picture, and we could see that picture by clicking right here. That's the image. It's an image file that gets slapped onto the surface. Okay. Now, certain materials have the image file itself, and then they also have what we call a bump. Bring this down. And of course, I'm not going to be able to find the bump right now. Let's go back. Let's click on this. Here we go. Okay. We went back. So the first image here that you see here, this is the main image that is giving us what we see for the roof tile. However, down below, you see this, it says bump, normal, and displacement. And this is also an image file. Now, what bump images do is it adds kind of a certain amount of depth to another image. So like when you overlay two images, but you change the contrast just slightly on the other image, right? It's very small. But if you change the contrast, or if you alter the bump image in any way, and then you overlay it with the original image, then you begin to add some level of depth to the material. So, and in a two-dimensional image, like a realistic render, that depth kind of comes off as looking as a certain thickness, right? If we play with shadows, if we play with the amount of light that a material gets, it starts to look three-dimensional. It starts to adjust the original image. So some materials have bumps. You'll notice that, you know, a paint doesn't have a bump. The metal aluminum doesn't have a bump. I don't think the glass doesn't have a bump. So certain materials have them, certain materials don't. The roofing material does, right? But for what we're trying to do here is we have to understand that what we're working with are simply image files. Okay. Now, when I click on the image, that little box right there, that takes me to the image settings. So this is where, if I wanted to, I could play around with some of the qualities of the image. The one that I'm more interested in right now is the rotation, but we also have the size and the offset. Okay. I did mention when we added this that it looks a bit small. So we could actually go ahead and make that change right now to this material using these sliders. So if I just click and drag, you'll see that it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger as we move, right? Now this, you're going to have to kind of look at the entire thing and look at your entire model and see how big does this thing, how big should this look, right? Now these numbers where it says 4.675, this is not the size of your roof tile. This is the size of the image, right? So we are changing or adjusting the size of the image file. So don't get confused. Don't think that these numbers here are related at all to the material that's on here. Rhino has no idea that this is a roof tile. It just knows that it's an image, right? So we're going to go ahead and maybe scale this down just a little bit. I think that's a good size right around there. We also have the offset. And you know what? I'm purposely going to make this a little bit smaller just to talk about the offset. So what an offset does is it allows us to move the image. Okay, is to essentially slide the image in along the X and the Y axes. Now, the reason why that might be useful is because if we take a look here at this edge of the roof, it appears that the roof tile just ends about halfway in. And we know that roof tiling actually should end at the end of the roof tile, not halfway through. And so when we render this, it's going to look a bit odd just because the image is going to abruptly stop halfway into an image, halfway into the roof tile. But if I use my offset tool and slide this just down just a little bit, there we go. And I can even bring in some of, come on. Yeah, something like that, right? I bring in some of this thickness, then that's going to look much more realistic when I hit render, okay? So that's how we adjust the size and the offset. But I had talked about the rotation. So we can rotate, this is a slider, right? But we could also rotate by just double clicking and typing the dimension that we want. If I hit 90, enter. Now the problem is that what we're rotating is the entire material, just the same way that we were scaling the entire material. So now that we rotated it 90 degrees, this looks correct, right? These areas look correct, but these areas are now wrong. So I'm going to bring this back to 0. And so what we have to actually do is take our roof material and duplicate it so that we have two roofing materials, right? One roofing material will have the tile going in one direction, the other roofing material will have the tile going in another direction. So I'm going to right click on my material, come about halfway down until duplicate. Okay? And I'll go ahead and double click inside here and then just, you know what, I'll go ahead and start here. We'll type in rotated ceramic. Okay. And so now I'll hit the shift key, select these two objects, right click, and assign to objects. Okay. Now it doesn't look like anything happened because it's the same material. We haven't done anything to this material. But if I now go on this material, click on the image, and now I change the rotation, double click, 90, enter. There we go. Now we could see that these sides got moved. And now that looks correct. So now we have our windows, we have the walls painted, we have the roofs. We're going to want to add material to our fascia. Probably not the same color, so let's quickly just hit the plus sign. We'll choose another color. And again, it doesn't really matter. Let's go ahead and actually let's purposely pick a color and then change that color. So I'll go ahead and click in here and, I don't know. Maybe I want something in the green, gray. See, this is both the fun part and the dangerous part of adding materials is you can spend a lot of time picking the right colors, right? Um, so there I've picked a color. I'll hold down the shift key. I'm actually going to just apply all of the fascia board or select all of the fascia board, and then I'll right click and assign to objects. There we go. It's okay. All right. Now, a few more things that we're going to do is how do we add a material? How do we add a new material? So we've been going up to um, the material icon to add a new material, and we've been going to the materials library, right? But what happens if they don't have the material I want, like concrete, right? If I go into architectural, if I go into floor, we have ceramics, terrazzo, and wood. Do we have it in? Let's go. Yeah, see, these are all terrazzo floors. They're not concrete floor. If I go into ceramics, um, no, none of these are good, right? There, if I'm looking for concrete, it's not here. So if there's a material I want, but I do not show it, or if it's not shown, then what I'm going to do is go into Google and let's go ahead and share my screen here. We're going to go into Google and we're going to type in um, the material we want, so concrete. And then I always end it with texture, seamless actually, texture seamless. Let's go over to images. And then I'll also click on high resolution because we want a high resolution image. Okay. Now, the reason why we put texture seamless is texture means that it's kind of a keyword that works because texture applies to the material that's going to be applied to a surface. That's what we call them, render tech or material textures. And then seamless is important. Let me go ahead and erase seamless. And these are still pretty good. These are all still pretty seamless. But remember, here's a good one. Remember that the way that materials are added in Rhino is that they're tiled um, over and over and over again, right? Just like our roof tiling was. And so what you want is an image where on one side, or that one side of the image is very similar to the opposite side. Because essentially, if we put the image that we see here side by side, where this side is touching this side, it's going to be a very clear and obvious stitch, right? We're going to clearly see where one image begins and one image finishes, right? But if we have a seamless tile, even here, this one might not be good. Even though the coloring is pretty good, we have this crack that you see, and then this, whatever this is, kind of this stain. That's going to be very noticeable when we actually tile this image as a material, right? We're going to see a lot of these little kind of half broken lines that just abruptly stop. If I click here, this is much better. This will work much better as a concrete material, right? This one probably won't just because we're going to see this pattern everywhere, right? So typing in seamless kind of narrows our search down, right? So then I'll go ahead and pick a material that I want. Let's go ahead and, that's more of a stucco. This one seems decent. Actually, let's go ahead and add it just because this little crack there, I want you to see what happens with when we start to add kind of cracks or something that, some sort of like graphic on the material. So I'll go ahead and right click. It's always important to open image in the new tab. If you try to save the image just as is, it's only saving this little square. It's not saving the actual higher resolution image. So once I have it here, we'll go ahead and right click, save image as, and I'm going to save this as concrete. We'll hit save. And now let's go ahead and go back into Rhino. Now the way that I add a material, what I actually end up doing is I copy or I'll add one material and then I just switch out the image. And it's that simple, right? But we want to select the correct material we want to select a material that is very similar to the material that we're adding. So in other words, if I'm adding concrete, I don't want to choose the glass material, right? Those are different properties, they're different things. But if I go into, maybe ceramics, but let's go into architectural, let's go into floor, and we'll use the ceramics in under the floor. Okay. And I'll go ahead and at this point, it doesn't really matter. Well, it does because it's reflective. I don't want a reflective concrete. So let's just pick tile 2, right? We'll hit open. I come down here, there's my tile 2. I'll go ahead and just click once inside and I'm going to call this concrete. I'll select my image and then right here under the image, I'll go ahead and click. And right here where it says file name, I'm going to go ahead and hit these 3 dots. And then I'm going to locate my new folder, which is on my desktop. I think it's desktop image. Oh, right here, materials, concrete. We'll hit open, and there's the concrete. Okay. If I click back over here, let's go ahead and change the bump. Remember, the bump is part of the image itself. So we'll click inside here, we'll hit this, and add the same image. Okay. So now that I have that, I can go ahead and say, select this image, or select that object, right click, and assign to object. Okay. And there is my image. Now you see what I mean? First of all, you see how it looks like a tile? Now the coloring is still pretty much the same, although obviously now the corners is where we have um, kind of a darker tone. And as we zoom in, we see there's that crack I was talking about, right? And so you can see that it looks pretty tiley, and that's not what I want at all. So I'm going to come back to my image. Let's go back to click on the image itself, and this is where I'm going to adjust the size. And then I could adjust the offset. Hmm. Let's go. Let's get that. Nope. And see if I could get that to line up there. Right. Now it's going to, this is exactly why I wanted we want to make sure that when we add the image or when we select the image, it really is a seamless image. Because if not, then we run into this issue. So let's stretch it out. And let's see if I really want that line to line up right there, but it's not. But again, at this point, this is where I would say, you know what, this image itself doesn't really work for my needs. So I would go back to Google and find a different concrete image and then swap that in place, right? And so those are like the basic methods of adding materials to your Rhino model. Okay. Now I will really quickly, just a little trick. It's a lot easier to add materials on the outside just because we could orbit around. It gets a lot harder to add materials once we get to the inside of the buildings, right? Like if I wanted to come in and add a material or an accent wall to, inside here, you really have to move the camera around really slowly to get into some of those tight spaces. Because if not, it's really easy to get lost and stuck inside walls and be completely, lost inside your model. So one of the things, there's 2 things you can do. You can use your layers and turn off layers and turn them on, and it'll make it a bit easier. So we can turn off our roof layers. Maybe we don't want our floors because we're trying to, I'm just gonna go in and I could add, select, or find the things I want this way. All right, turning off the floors and the roofs goes a very long way. But even then, if you need to go in deeper, right, or if you want to get closer, then the other thing you can do is adjust the length and dolly. Okay, the way we do that is let's get ourselves into a really kind of tight space right here. Right, so let's say I wanted to get right in here, but even if I zoom out just a little bit, I'm in a wall. Okay, and this here doesn't really, you know, it seems super close up. So what I can do is come over here to my pull down, go to camera, and we have the option of adjust length and dolly. Okay. Now what this does is it essentially changes the camera lens that we're looking at the project through. Okay. This does not adjust or do anything to the dimensions of the model. Although it looks like we're stretching the model, what it's going to end up doing is adjusting the lens on the camera into a kind of like a fisheye lens. So if we go to set camera, adjust length and dolly, and I'm going to left click, hold down on the button and move the mouse, right? So you could see that how I move the mouse, or depending on how much I move the mouse, it's going to really kind of stretch the image or make it a lot tighter and closer, right? So the reason why we're going to do this is because when it's stretched, it's a lot easier to move around. So I might sometimes, depending on the areas I'm trying to get into, I might exaggerate the stretch, something like that, right? And that's because you can see now I can move around a lot easier into some of these tighter spaces. Now it looks really weird. I will agree with that, but it'll make it a lot easier for me to go in and select certain walls, certain objects, so that I could apply the material. Now, once I'm done, I could always go back to set camera, adjust length and dolly, and bring it back to what I feel is a normal size, right? Or a normal perspective, just like that. Okay. So again, adding materials to the interiors, you could do that by turning off the layers or by adjusting the length and dolly. And that's going to help you kind of navigate your way through the model. Okay. Hopefully that helps. That's a really basic kind of crash course into materiality and how to add materials to your Rhino file. All right. So good luck, everyone.